Specifically, while we're talking about the future of our data, I left my coat and my bag over there, and I've been watching someone running around with it. Is it safe? Is my coat safe? I'm worried about my data. Okay, thank you for having me here. I'm thrilled to be here. I thought I'd start with a bit of a recap of where we've got to with social media. And the strange thing about the way that we've evolved social media is that it's changed based on each step of the way. No one has been able to guess 15 years ago the way that social media would evolve. And I thought I would take a step back and firstly give a perspective of how Twitter evolved, and then really just talk about the ecosystem, the way that I think these things are evolving, and talk specifically about how that impacts our data. So in the first instance, I wanted to sort of give you a brief reminder of how Twitter started. It's hard to imagine now, but there was a time about 13 years ago when Twitter first was created, when most people didn't have the internet on their phone. And Facebook didn't have a mobile app. So Twitter formed a couple of years after Facebook. And what happened at the time, there was, maybe a few of you used MSN Messenger. Did anyone use MSN Messenger? He's right. They really messed it up, didn't they? It's like something that was so adored by so many people and then just disappeared. But do you remember on Messenger or whatever you used, you could give a little line of what your status was? And people started using emoticons and crazy characters and started filling it with little things that tried to express what they were doing. And our founder, Jack Dorsey, spotted that. And in fact, Twitter used to be a podcasting company called Odeo. It was a company that was in the world of podcasting. And then one day, Steve Jobs stood up and announced that podcasts were coming to the podcast store, the iTunes store. And overnight, the Odeo business had no reason for existing. And one of the reasons why at Twitter we love hack weeks and doing things slightly differently is that those workers at Odeo set about trying to invent a new business. Imagine that. So you're trying to invent something new. Because here's the incredible thing, that we often talk about innovation and we often talk about culture, but very few businesses have ever invented a second act. Facebook, everything you know that Facebook has done since, they bought. Instagram, WhatsApp, Oculus, they bought them. Google, everything you know that Google has gone on to do apart from Google search, they bought. They bought Android, they bought YouTube, they bought almost every single part. Gmail was the only thing that they invented themselves, and largely copying an email app wasn't necessarily the greatest innovation ever. But so here's the amazing thing. When you've got one business, to come up with another business is an incredible task. And they set about, at their hack week, creating something. And they hacked together an idea, which was Twitter, which was the idea that you could text from your phone, not online, but you text from your phone an update of what you were doing. And it would text out all of your friends with what you were doing. But here's what they immediately started noticing. They noticed that when people could connect to lots of other people with these little status updates, this was before the news feed was on Facebook. Before they could, when they could update those things, it seemed to have this magical effect. And so from Jack saying, I'm setting up my Twitter, we started to notice happenings that hadn't been expected. So a plane landed in the River Hudson. Anytime you get on a plane, and if they say to you, in the unlikely event of a plane landing on water, this is what we need to do. You know that thing where they say the slides are going to come out? One plane in history has landed on water. And so this was the plane. It landed on the River Hudson, and they evacuated people. And someone tweeted it. But here was the amazing thing, that the person who tweeted it, I think at the time he tweeted it, he had about 30 followers. Very soon, his photograph was on the front of the New York Times. It was on the front of newspapers around the world. And it was pretty clear that it was a change in the way that media worked. Someone was chatting to me this morning, and they said, is social media a force for bad? But we've got to remember what came before social media. So what came before social media was the idea that rich men owned the means of giving media. And occasionally there were state broadcasters, occasionally there were companies, but people owned the means of media. And immediately that was transformed. It was no longer the person who was in the position of power who had the means of media. It was the person who had the best access. The person who was in a situation that they could see something that was happening. And that was revolutionary. That transformed the way that we think about how media works now. Thinking about the implication of that, playing that through, it's inconceivable to me that if we went back 13 years, that a 16-year-old Swedish girl would be one of the most well-known people in the world. Why? Because when would that ever reach the situation where a newspaper would want to put it on the front of a newspaper, or a broadcaster would put it on the main channel? And so Greta Thunberg's journey is just one illustration that when we've seen the democratization of how news is spread, when news is spread not by who has the most power, but who's interested in it, it transformed the relationship. And so Twitter started seeing a number of things form. Very quickly, we saw forest fires happening in California, and people were using Twitter that had no search function. People were using Twitter and hacking it so they could search for mentions of fire. We saw very quickly there was a change in the way that people were expecting to be able to receive things. The thing that we've always found really important at Twitter is that it's asynchronous. So that means you can follow someone without necessarily them following you back. We've also stood really firmly by a number of key principles that at times were deeply unpopular. So our philosophy was always, you don't need to say who you are to be able to tweet. One of the things that we saw through that was during the Arab Spring, a decade ago, we were seeing a lot of people tweeting from positions where they didn't want their identity to be known, but they were tweeting about that and sharing information. We see that today in Hong Kong, where still now Twitter's incredibly popular in Hong Kong. People are able to share under the cloud of anonymity facts and information about what's happening. Not all social networks permit that. Not all social networks permit that degree of anonymity. But what's happened is it's facilitated some incredible discussions. You see discussions about depression. You see discussions about postpartum depression, where mothers who feel maybe they would be embarrassed to discuss it with their friends, they're able to draw in friends, and they're able to draw strangers close to them to share their news, their discussions, their emotions, their feelings. So that's always been a critical part of the way that we've seen Twitter as different. That means that when it comes to data, we have a massive disadvantage. And to a large extent, that's by design. When you sign up for Twitter, you don't give your real name. You don't give your real gender. You don't give your age. You don't give where you live. You give nothing other than an email address and sometimes a telephone number to connect you to a device. But that's it. And in fact, largely the business that you've seen of internet advertising that funds most of the content you see online is in an arms race to try and get more data, to try and hold more pieces of information about you. Because each one of those atoms of information, other companies often can turn into a higher price, more money. Resolutely, that's not been our take on things. And it's been one of the questions that investors always ask. Why don't you try and enrich the data that you have? We've never felt that that's an important principle. So how has social media evolved? Well, one of the things that we've seen over the last few years is there's been a real change in the way that social media has developed. One of the things that happened for a long time is that there was big discussions about news feeds, about timelines, and the question of how you run those things. So Twitter has always been resolute that you choose who you follow in your timeline, and then we only show you tweets from those people. And one of the things that happened was that other platforms have built algorithms, they've tried to control that. We resisted that for a very long time. And in fact, one of the things that you get as a consequence is people often will say, okay, but doesn't this create a filter bubble? If you're only seeing things that from your friends, from political vantage points that you're interested in, doesn't that mean that you get into confirmation bias, that you're only hearing things that agree with you? It's really interesting because we hear that all the time. One of the things that people often challenge social media, they say, but it's just this filter bubble. Why aren't you doing anything to change it? So we did. We tried some experiments. One of the wonderful things about when you've got hundreds of millions of people using your platform, you can try lots of different things to see the impact that has. And we very quickly can learn things. So here's what we did. We started showing things in people's feed, in people's timeline. We started showing things that they hadn't followed. And our thinking was this: why don't we show things that other people have liked? Why don't we show things that other people are interested in? It was the most unpopular feature we've ever introduced. Because I think here's what happens. We're all keen for other people not to be in a filter bubble, but we're very happy to be in one ourselves. We're very happy to be the person responsible for controlling what we consume, but we want everyone else to consume more diverse stuff. Really interesting because it comes to the heart of one of the challenges of everything to do with the internet. The golden rule is this. Maybe the golden rule to do with everything to do with politics. Beware of simple answers to complicated questions. Because quite often we find ourselves presented in a world of complexity. We find ourselves presented with reductive, simple answers, often by politicians, often by experts, and they often come along and they'll say, you just need to do this. Quite often we hear, maybe when presented with one of the challenges that we face on a daily basis, and I suspect one of the challenges that other organizations, other social media companies face all the time, people say, you just need an algorithm for this. Here's what you need to do this. And almost without exception, in fact, in almost every case you can imagine, some of the brightest engineers you can ever wish to meet have spent hours and weeks and months working on it. And they've realized very quickly that if you do that, it has a very big, unexpected consequence. It goes wrong. In fact, one of the things that we often find ourselves trying to do is trying to imagine the consequence of every single action we take. The way that one of my colleagues describes it is that when there's 500 million tweets every day, it means that 1 in a million circumstance that you think maybe there's a 1 in a million chance that this goes wrong, that means that happens 500 times every day. And so that's one of the challenges for us. People often say, did you not think about this? Absolutely, resolutely, we did. But these things are immensely complicated. I think it's become increasingly hard as well over the last few years because we've recognized that quite often people are no longer using some of the platforms that exist just for positive purposes. They're using them to deliberately subvert them. They're using them to take actions that aren't well-intentioned. Always our presumption was presume good intent. Presume good intent. I think the lesson of the internet, the internet era that we've all lived through, is that over time we've realized that in fact human beings have, when we're presented with a screen, we often fail to connect with empathy with the person at the other end of the screen. We sometimes forget those things. Quite often celebrities will see Instagram comments or Twitter comments that are unnecessarily harsh and unnecessarily cruel because we forget that Kylie Jenner is a person. We forget that the person that Rihanna is a person. We forget that because to some extent we're faced with something that expresses no emotions, and so we try and get a reaction out of it. The lesson of the internet era is that empathy gap is something that we as society need to think about. It's not addressed by just banning certain things online. It's something that we need to address in society rather than pretend that it's an internet problem. It's actually a societal problem. So it comes to the question of thinking about data and how we work. One of the things that we hold ourselves immensely high to an immensely high standard is thinking about how we use data. I mentioned to you that we've got a deep philosophical difference in terms of how we use data, what we expect from people, and we are very limited in what we ask. Now, when people find themselves looking at alcohol-related content, we might ask people's age, but we don't set about trying to profile individuals and build them. What we try and do is try and understand a person, understand what they might be interested in, not by who they are represented by, their location, their age, their affluence, their gender, but rather more by what they're interested in. We sort of see ourselves to some extent as an interest network rather than a social network. If you're interested in Ajax, if you're interested in pop music, if you're interested in going on holiday to certain locations, then over time, the fact that you look at those things more, that you search for those things more, starts giving us indications of what else you might like to see. A product I think that is fascinating right now is TikTok. TikTok does that extraordinarily well. It doesn't ask you to customize the experience. It customizes the experience for you based on what you like, what you watch. Really interesting because I think it helps redefine how all social platforms think about things. It earns its way for you to watch more of it rather than you having to put more information in. When people first went to Facebook, they were invited to put their favorite movies in, put their favorite teams in. Now, what we're seeing far more is that through machine learning, through artificial intelligence, the systems are trying to customize for you, irrespective of who you are. But I mentioned that we hold ourselves to an incredibly high moral code. And I just want to sort of give you an illustration what that means and how that plays out. One of the things that we've set about doing, our founder, Jack Dorsey, created the company 13 years ago. And truly fascinating individual, wonderful, incredibly talented individual. I mentioned to you that Google never invented a second act, that Facebook never invented a second act, but Jack left Twitter after he'd been in Twitter for about 5 years, and he went on to invent another company, Square. Now, if you go to the US, you often go into small-town America, and there's no retail stores that you recognize. There's no brands that you recognize. There's a lot of brands that are owned by local people. And these businesses often didn't accept credit cards. So Jack set up a business that used the audio jack in telephones, in our mobile phones, to allow those businesses to accept credit cards. He created 2 businesses. He's now the chief exec of both of them. He runs Twitter in the morning and Square in the afternoon. Quite good going. He only really works about 8 hours a day, so incredibly accomplished. But here's one of the things that he's really resolute. One of the things he's insistent on. He says that I think it's important for us to recognize you only get one reputation. We sometimes forget that. We sometimes think that reputations are like the lives in video games, that we can re-up them. And actually, that's just not the case. We get one reputation, and if you use it, you'll never get one back. And so what that means is, if we're going to earn people's trust, if we're going to earn the trust of the people who use the Twitter app, we need to operate to the highest moral code. But what does that mean? So it means that when things go wrong, we tell people them. And so to give you a scenario, about 12 months ago, we realized we were in the midst of a data breach. And this is something that often these things become known to a team gradually, and then you realize the consequence of them very quickly. And in this case, we realized that sometimes when people were typing their password into Twitter, we were storing it in a plain text format. It was only affecting a small number of our users, but it meant that had someone hacked into Twitter there and then, they would be able to read those passwords. Now, to make an announcement that several million, I think it was about 13 million people, had their passwords stored in an insecure format, is something that a lot of companies might have chosen not to announce. There was no evidence that anyone had seen the passwords. There was no evidence that we'd been hacked. But even though it was a difficult thing to do, Jack told us, okay, well, our standard has to be that we tell people immediately. It raises really big moral concerns. A lot of businesses would choose not to do that because it casts them in a really bad light. We announced it in a matter of about 36 hours from when we discovered it. What happened was there was an immediate explosion of news coverage. Tech firms don't announce things like this. Tech firms don't set out to be that transparent when they've done something wrong. But what was interesting is what happened next. All of the tech journalists who commentate on InfoSec and security, there was the first wave of reportage, and then the day later, there was almost a consensus that if we criticize Twitter for doing this, then there's no incentive for any company ever to be honest. And we've stood by that. Every time something goes wrong, we immediately say to ourselves, the right thing to do is to announce this. Another example is that we used to publish our monthly audience. And our monthly audience was a number that was in the public domain. Largely, we used to publish our monthly audience because it was what our competitors had done. Our daily audience was what we worked on. We see Twitter as a news app. People come to Twitter every day if they use it, they come to follow their local football team. They come to see the latest with the TV show they watch. They come to see the latest with politics. It's a daily news app. We knew that our daily audience was really strong. It's been growing strongly for the last 3 years, but we didn't publish that number. And there was a concern that if we published that number, it might be lower than some people expected. Our monthly number was in 300 millions. Our daily number was around half of that. But when we reached the decision to do it, our chief exec said there was big debates in the company, but wouldn't this damage the value of the company if we have a low number? And Jack Dorsey said, well, if that's true, and a bigger number would make our company seem more valuable, then we really should publish it because we're misleading people. We would be misleading people if we gave them the wrong impression. We published that number. The value of the company dropped for about 2 weeks. But then the value of the company returned to where it had previously been. And I think it's in those small decisions that you realize what lies at the moral heart of an organization. It means that anytime any of us are confronted with whether it's data breaches or whether we reveal things, our onus, the onus on us is that there's a higher ethical code. I think a lot about workplace culture, and I'm obsessed with it. I've been fortunate to work at Google, at YouTube, work at Twitter now. I've worked at other organizations. And for me, there's a genuine delight in working in a place that feels highly motivated, highly productive. But through all of my learnings, there's one thing that I'm really clear on more than anything else. What shapes the culture of an organization is the actions people take. Rather than the things they write on the wall, rather than the marketing they might project, the actions people take determine the culture of an organization. And when it comes to data, it means that we believe it's an important principle for us that we don't seek to get more data from people who use the app than we need to give them a good experience. We don't set out to monetize that excessively and turn that into something that's an asset for our business. But also, when we feel that we've broken the trust, when we feel that we've allowed data to leak out of the system, it's an important principle for us that we share that and we immediately announce that, even if it's at the expense of damaging the company's esteem in the short term. We know that it's an important thing for us to do. But that helps inform other decisions for us as well. You might have seen a couple of weeks ago we announced that Twitter was no longer going to accept political advertising. And that's an immensely complex decision. One of the things that people say when you say that you're not going to accept political advertising, money runs throughout the operating system of politics in the US. There's one election in US history that hasn't been won by the candidate who raised the most money. It completely runs throughout the whole of the operating model of American politics. And one of the things that people say when you ban political advertising, they say that, doesn't that mean that favors the incumbent? Because you've got one person who's immensely famous and one person who's a challenger. And our feeling was that we felt that this was an immensely complex issue, combined with the incredible power of targeting that social media provides, that advertisers are able to target based on, not necessarily on Twitter, but incredible amounts of information. We felt that it was something that we wanted to opt out of. We didn't want that to be the case, especially if organizations were allowing people to promote something that was demonstrably untrue. it raised important questions for us, who was going to be the arbiter of that, and we didn't want to play a part in that. So it raised an important ethical question. And I think to the point I raised before, if companies become the actions they take, if companies become the decisions they make, then it was a really important principle for us to be resolute that we felt that we wanted to hold ourselves to a higher moral code that then maybe we needed to operate in the space. What happens in those situations is these immense amount of opinion. Other companies disagree. Our feeling was that we wanted to ensure that we weren't making decisions for money. I think one of the most important truisms that anyone can be faced is that a principle is only a principle when it costs you something. And for us, we felt that this was a principle we held dear. So back to when Twitter first started, back to us imagining how the internet was going to evolve. I don't think anyone knew when they were creating text messages that you could update your status, that anyone would be imagining that the power of countries would be determined by these things. And it's just a good illustration of how these things can develop unexpectedly. Anyone who's an early user of Instagram will remember that there was definitely a couple of years at the early days of Instagram that it seemed like a project of everyone documenting every meal they ate in restaurants. It seemed like everyone was just photographing plates of food. And what we've seen over time is our use of social products has evolved. What we've seen is that largely now different social products, far more even than 5 years ago, have got different functions to them. Certain products that are really good for keeping connected with your grandparents, with your family. Certain products that are just about beautiful photography. We see Twitter as about connecting with the news. When you open the app for different products, you open it for different reasons. And I think that's evolved over time. As we're thinking about that going forwards, it's pretty clear that the way we use all of the social products now will be different in 5 years from what it is today. And that will evolve and develop. For our feeling, we want to be sure that anyone who works on Twitter feels resolutely it gives a voice to the voiceless. I've been following all this week the disturbances that have been happening over the last month, really, in Lebanon and Beirut. And Twitter often gives a voice to those who have no say, who have no power. It gives you a great perspective of seeing what goes on. Our feeling when we're seeing untold change, when we're seeing the development of technology, the development of the way that we connect with each other changing, that being underpinned by a strong moral code is a really important part of our values and how we believe this is important. So as we're debating today, who owns data, who owns the data that we create, our feeling is really strongly that it belongs to the people who use these products. We're resolute that we don't want more data than we need to provide a good service. And we hope that largely as the debate goes on, people will be able to express their opinions on those things and be able to assert whether they believe that the relationship is a fair one, whether the quid pro quo is appropriate. Clearly, these things are immensely complicated. You know, the one thing, again, I said it before, and probably I'll end on, is beware of simple answers to complex questions. When anyone's imagining anything, it's always easy for us to jump to something that sounds convincing, but isn't always right. People often ask me about the American president. If you work at Twitter, you can't go a day without someone asking about the American president and how he uses Twitter. And here's the amazing thing, is that all of the people who raise those questions, they never used to talk about how the internet had transformed politics before. When Barack Obama first won election in 2008, the one thing he was credited for was transforming the relationship of politics because he gained millions of donors from a clever use of the internet. But sometimes we make the mistake of thinking politicians we agree with are doing the right things, and politicians we disagree with are doing the wrong things, and we can't stand it. In fact, more than anything before, I think all of these things are a reminder that irrespective of what we believe and irrespective of the politicians we value, the internet is a fact of life. The best politicians, whether they are issue politicians like Greta Thunberg, whether they are politicians seeking your vote, the best politicians always from now on will be the ones who use the tools of creating content, of distributing that, of reaching audiences online better than those against them. We're never going to uninvent the means that have been created now. And I think it's down to all of us to embrace how those things enable a positive future and work out how we can be part of that. Thank you very much. You take questions?
Yes. Please stay with us for a while. Thank you, Bruce, for this talk. We've covered now a number of things. And one of them is the trends that you've seen in the past few years, right? So the democratization of media, being able to be in touch with your grandparents through Twitter, or what are some of the, let's say, trends that you see coming up that you're most excited about?
Yeah, I think I mentioned TikTok. It's sort of very lightweight personalization, sort of customizing an experience very quickly. I think YouTube has really has done a lot of that. What we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years, if the last revolution was mobile and bringing it to people's phones, there's been a real transformation in how machine learning has impacted social tools. So to give you a Twitter example, half of all the accounts that we suspend for doing bad things are suspended now by machine learning without a human being ever seeing them. Why? Because we can learn very quickly the fingerprints of how someone who's setting out to do bad things, what the fingerprints of that looks like. And these things are why the recommendations on YouTube are better than ever before, why TikTok shows you content that will make you laugh within 1 minute. It's because the technology, the rapid learning is growing faster than ever before. So I think we're going to see a lot more development of that, a lot more improvement of how these things try and second guess our instincts, really.
Mm. And how do you think, so I have a lot of questions, but think about your questions as well, because you will be able to ask them. How do you think that will impact us as citizens or as society in general?
Yeah, I think people are more savvy than ever before. So immediately now, when we're shown something, I think certainly the generation in the room today, our first instinct when we see something, we wonder, I wonder why that's been shown to me. Now, it's definitely true that there's an older generation that doesn't go through that thinking process, that doesn't realize that there's alchemy at work to show agreeable stuff. But I think, to a conscious audience, I think that's a real fascination. Clearly now we can opt through European law, we can opt to maybe have advertising shown to us that isn't targeted at us. And that's interesting as well, the opportunity to opt out of something that feels micro-targeted into something that's broader sometimes can be appealing in its own way or can be frustrating in its own way.
All right, thank you. Any questions from the audience? Don't be shy now. You all shared your questions? Yep. Do we have someone with a microphone?
Test. No?
Where are you
Hello?
at?
Oh, yes. I think I'm over here. Shall I stand up?
Yeah.
So my question is, as you mentioned before, there's a clear boundary between how people use their social media and how much of the privacy they are actually, they know that, sorry, I'll start over. So there's, in the privacy way, you know that there are a lot of apps using your privacy, but you still use them. So there's a clear boundary between, Google uses your privacy to get better search results, but you don't use DuckDuckGo because Google's better. It has a better search engine. So where do you see the boundary between how good things have to be to use your privacy in their apps?
Yeah, I think you raised an
hope it's,
important point about whether privacy is a feature or whether it's something that people don't value. I definitely think that what Apple have tried to do over the last 12 months is differentiate Apple as having the feature of privacy and the focus on that. Now, I guess the question then becomes, do people value privacy over time to the extent that they're prepared to walk away from some of the products they love? And are they willing to not give all of their data, but in return, not use all of the products? I think it's a fascinating debate. It's a shame, I think, to a large extent, that we need to enter into that trade-off, that we need to allow our phone's location to be tracked all day to take advantage of a good search engine. But I think there's going to be a more and more debate and discussion on those things. The question is whether that discussion becomes mainstream and whether people care enough to stop using certain products.
All right, does that answer your question? Yes? More questions. One in the front.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Marisa Monteiro. In the follow-up of this question regarding what we value, normally to value something we need to understand, time or data. You said that people are getting savvier. Do you honestly think that people understand what happens with our data? Because the last time that I hear people commenting, they always say, I don't have anything to hide. So do you think that the big tech is doing enough to make people aware of the dangers of the share of their own data?
Right, so to illustrate the point that I made before, so beware simple answers to complex questions. So here's the question. What do you believe, say if you were running Google or Facebook, what do you believe they need to do to educate people on that? Because the question becomes a really fascinating one. How can they get people's attention to tell them? If they're instructed by law, for example, that they need to tell people, then it becomes a really interesting conundrum. How do they get to 90% of people knowing the deal that they've entered into? I struggle to see how we'll ever achieve that degree of understanding, because most people aren't interested enough to even participate in that discussion. It's one of the challenges of it. So people say, users, I'm reluctant to use the word users, but people, they need to be informed. And, I'm fortunate that I don't feel that we participate in these sort of data trade-offs. But users need to be informed. The question is, tell me how you're going to inform them. Because I'm resolute that probably your mum, brother, cousin, uncle doesn't want to watch a 10-minute film about what their data's, what's happening with their data. I think probably it's legislation that needs to change rather than information.
Thank you. Other questions?
There's one here.
Yes.
Where's my bag, though? I trusted you.
Is it working? Yeah, it's working. Right. Hi. I had a question about the GDPR, especially how did it affect Twitter, and did it have any drawbacks, Twitter, or not?
Yeah, so GDPR, the sort of European regulation of data and giving rules. I think the interesting thing is that if you read the rules of GDPR, it says that your denial of allowing people to use your data shouldn't prevent you from enjoying the service. That's what it says. So, and there are definitely some social apps where if you say that you're not going to allow them to use your data, I don't want to go into names, but they say, great, you can't use our product anymore. We're about to offboard you. So it's interesting. I don't think we've seen the final implementation of that. One of the ways it affected us is that we, as part of GDPR, we are not allowed to have people under a certain age, I think it's under 15, on Twitter. And so when people put in their age and they're under 15, we immediately throw them off the website. So, and that upset a lot of people because, again, everyone's fine with rules affecting other people. They just don't want rules affecting them. So we had things like that that did affect us. Generally, when it comes down to most data, as I said before, we're very lightweight. We try not to gather a lot of information on people. So it didn't have a massive effect, but it definitely was, being compliant with it was something that consumed the company's attention for 6 months.
Thank you.
Thank you. More questions from the audience, maybe on this side?
There's
See
one
one over there?
here, right behind you there. And then afterwards, the lady up there's had her hand up for a while.
Hello, yeah, another follow-up, especially with the GDPR, and so we're living in a global world, and each country or continent, for example, European Union or USA, starting to come up with their own legislations and their own rules for what is allowed or what is not. What do you think about a person's that may be in one country or another role in this global situation with different rules and different multinational companies?
Yeah, it's immensely complex. So I guess the question is, how do you build products for different laws in different countries? And it's, to give you an example, in Germany, there are certain things you're not allowed to say in public. In Indonesia, you're not allowed to insult the royal family. So in Indonesia, you're not allowed to say something bad against the royal ruler of Indonesia. Now, most of us would regard it as our right to be able to say an opinion bad against a ruler. And so, obviously, it creates interesting cultural differences. Should we ban people from anyone in the world insulting the Indonesian leader? Should it just be in Indonesia that happened? You can imagine then, obviously, whatever amount of countries there are in the world, 170 countries, 200 countries, there's some countries that aren't democracies. Should we allow the rulers of those countries to demand that certain content is taken down? There are some social products that do that. There are some social products that, if they're instructed by big governments and big sort of tyrannical figures, they will take that content down. We don't do that. And so we've never done that. Every year we publish all of the requests we get from governments around the world. We illustrate by country how many requests we've had and what we did with those requests, because we're convinced that being open and transparent, while it might mean that governments of certain countries are less favourable at us and give us a harder time, we're convinced it's the right thing to do. But, there are some much bigger companies that go along with those requests because they see it as advantageous to their business. Mm-hmm. There was that lady there with her hand. No, just there, she's waving her hand there.
Thank you very much.
Yes,
I find Twitter as an information platform very fascinating and also important. But I actually have two questions, and the first one relates to your comment on, when things go wrong, we tell the people. Don't you think that transparency should start before? And so, for instance, with regards to the algorithmic newsfeed, shouldn't users be more aware and also be made aware of earlier about how their newsfeed is curated and how the data is actually used? And the second question, touches...
So specifically on that, newsfeed is as a Facebook product. You mean their Twitter timeline, or...?
Yes, sorry.
Right, okay, go on.
And the second question touches upon the political ads. So as far as I understood is that it also prohibits political organizations to, for instance, advertise sustainable energy.
Yeah, that's incorrect. We haven't announced the rules of how it works, but that's not how it will work. So specifically to look at the algorithm one, the way that the algorithm works, I guess the question would be how you would inform someone how an algorithm works. It's back to simple answer to a complex question. That's how would you meaningfully tell people? The way that we set about doing it is that we allow you to go and see the interests that we have labelled against you. So if it appears that you like K-pop, or if it appears that you like MMA wrestling, then when you go to your interests page, you'll see that we have ascribed that interest to you. You can actually choose to turn that interest off, or you can choose to reset all your interests, or to have no interest stored against you. But I think that's the best way that we've seen to try and at least give a degree of transparency about how that process would work.
And could you maybe elaborate on the political ads?
Yeah, so we announced it 2 weeks ago. We haven't announced the full mechanics of it, but instrumental in our thinking is we don't want to create a situation where some corporate organisations could promote their opinion on something, but charities wouldn't promote theirs. We haven't promoted the rules, but if you look into Elizabeth Warren, the presidential candidate in the US, said exactly what you've said there, and Jack Dorsey replied to her that that's not going to be the way it works. So while we haven't fully published the information, that's a slightly misconstrued version of how it would work. That's not the intention at all.
All right. Thank you. I think we have one last question on this side. He's really eager to ask.
Hi.
We have one in the back as well? Okay, so
Yeah.
2 questions. Yep.
So I was wondering, you also offer services like Twitter analytics and Twitter conversion tracking. So how do you treat that kind of data? And also companies that use Twitter analytics, for example, how do you feel about them using that or firing a third-party pixel before there's consent from the user on the website based on the new GDPR rules from the European Court?
So no tweets are pixeled. So if you're scrolling through your timeline, we don't pixel anything in your timeline. If you click on a link, then that can fire a pixel. So that can fire, but you've clicked on a link to go through to a third-party website. So that inevitably would be trackable anyway by anyone who wanted to put a trackable link in there.
Does it answer your question? All right. One person left. One question in the front. And then we move on to the next. Yeah.
Hi. First of all, I'd like to thank you for your talk. It was very insightful. And you mentioned quite sometimes Facebook and Google, so other competitors. If I'm not mistaken, Facebook is more like a service provider. At least that is their business model. So they give other companies insights in the data and allow them to make better targeted ads. And Twitter, in the country, is a data vendor. So basically, selling the exact mirror data to other companies. Don't you think that, and not knowing what they do with that data, don't you think that it's less responsible to sell exact mirror data to other companies and not knowing for what purposes they are used?
Yeah, I think it's an important qualification to say what that actually means. So when we sell data in aggregate rather than individually identifiable. So what that might mean is if someone is interested in the discussions of cars over the last 12 months, in aggregate you can see those trends and how they've developed, but you would never be able to identify you would never be able to say, this individual who lives here does this. It's more a means of spotting trends. And we've seen that's been used by the Center for Disease Control in the US. They've used it to track whether there's outbreaks of flu or whether there's outbreaks of illnesses. But it's never, oh, we've identified that guy there has flu. So it's more about it's almost enabling people to forecast the weather rather than identify households that are experiencing rain.
Okay, thank you. Well, there is one follow-up question then. Because like Facebook, even though you do not exactly ask for it or explicitly ask for it, Twitter does have access to data from people's devices, don't they?
Yeah, so it's just a question of what data we use, and I guess, so if you look...
family contacts and stuff like that, that's what I see here.
If you look into the permissions of what we use, it's far more limited than other apps.
Okay.
So what we don't do, for example, we don't track your location when you're not using the app. We don't go into your messages. We don't go into your call log. We don't go through a lot of the things that routinely we might click yes, okay on. We actually use very limited data of the way the product is used.
I still see a lot of questions arising, and I see that you still have more questions. I think those are good to keep them for the break. Thank you very much,
Thank
Bruce,
you.
for your talk.